On January 9th, AMD held their first ever keynote at CES 2019 in Las Vegas. And due to the leaks provided on Reddit and YouTube, expectations were high. AMD was expected to announce 7nm products, either from the new generation of Ryzen CPUs or from the lineup of Navi GPUs. Both were leaked to provide excellent price to performance in their respectable market segments. But after about 14 minutes of Lisa Su teasing how 7nm helps them improve products, talking about Ryzen Mobile and for some reason having Phil Spencer on stage with her, she dropped this on us. Via a shiny trailer, they announced what is basically a castrated Instinct MI60 with a shiny gaming heatsink on it. Honestly, my first reaction to this was straight up confusion, since the Radeon Instinct cards, while being decent at FP16 and FP32 computing, are far away from being impressive in gaming. But still, here we are, Lisa being on stage, comparing the Radeon VII to an RTX 2080. Although one should never only rely on first-party benchmarks for performance comparisons, the 7 at least being in the neighborhood of the RTX 2080 looked promising enough to me. However, no price was mentioned during the keynote, and for good reason. The Radeon VII is going to launch on February 7th for a whopping $699 MSRP. Alongside the price, quite some information has been released shortly after the presentation. According to that, the card features a slightly cut down Vega 20 GPU with 60 of the 64 CUs enabled, with a 1450 MHz base clock and a 1800 MHz what AMD calls burst clock. The chip features 16GB of HBM2 that is connected via a 4096-bit memory bus in a 4-stack configuration, much like 2015's Fury cards. Now that we are all up to speed, we can talk about performance. On stage, the 7 was compared to the RTX 2080 and AMD's own Vega 64. Luckily, I have the latter here to test. Testing poses a few problems, however. Vega, especially Vega 64, has extremely unstable clock speeds. The base clock for the reference Vega 64, according to AMD, is 1200 MHz with a boost clock of 1536 MHz. Out of the box, a reference design will try to hit said boost clock, quickly start to throttle, and bounce around in the 1300 to 1450 MHz range. There's inherently nothing wrong with this behavior. This is how they are intended to operate, but this gives us a pretty big range of clock speeds and therefore performance that we can compare the 7 to. Matters get even more complicated when considering that Vega 64 can be tuned in order to run at significantly higher clock speeds reliably. My own Vega 64, for example, runs at 1660 MHz constantly. In the real world, there is quite a performance difference here. In 3D Max Time Spy, the jump from 1350 to 1660 MHz amounts to a jump of about 1300 points for the GPU score. Let's start off with a worst case scenario for the Radeon VII. According to the CES keynote, we can expect a performance increase of 25 to 42% in games. Therefore, we are going to calculate a 25% performance gain compared to a Vega 64 running at a locked 1350 MHz. I stabilized the clocks by flashing a Vega 64 liquid-cooled edition BIOS onto the card, setting the power limit to 150% and undervolting the card. By doing so, clocks in the two highest power states can just be set and for the most part reliably hit by the card. On display, you can see the first set of scores for the card at a given clock speed. Please note that the highest one at 1660 MHz is the only one of the bunch that is officially an overclock and has been included to show the potential of the card. Now, we can add 25 and 42% to the scores respectively and get the following results. From that, we can extrapolate a pretty wide window in which our performance should be according to the keynote. 25% faster than a Vega 64 clocked at 1350 MHz equates to a score of 8183, while being 42% faster than the Vega set to 1536 MHz. For comparison, an RTX 2080 Fe model is expected to score 10,900 points. These results are anything but overwhelming. Even in the edge case of a 42% performance gain compared to a Vega 64 stabilized at its boost clock, we can't match the RTX 2080. This makes the Radeon VII not look compelling from the get-go. But let's look at it from a different, more realistic angle. While comparing the 7 to the Vega via percentual gains is fine, it is far more useful to look at the performance that we can extrapolate from the technical aspects of the card that are already confirmed. In most aspects, the two cards are very similar, but not quite the same. While they both feature 64 ROPs, the Radeon VII has only 60 compute units enabled, versus the 2017 flagship's 64. This results in fewer shading units as well as fewer texture mapping units. At a 7% difference, the numbers are close enough that I don't feel the need to account for the slightly cut down chip in the performance calculation. However, much more interesting is the difference in memory configuration. On the 7, we have doubled the memory bus at a higher clock speed compared to the Vega 64. Due to the resulting scores being interesting, I decided to test more core frequencies, while also taking memory clock into account. Core clocks from 1050 up until 1660 MHz have been tested, with memory sitting at 945 MHz stock and 1100 MHz overclock. While the performance increase due to the higher memory clock starts at a mild 2%, the gains become greater and greater as core frequency is increased. Instead of the slightly regressing scaling with core clock speed that can be observed without the faster memory, the second suite of tests show a linear correlation of core clock and GPU score. By calculating the function that the trend of the results follow, we can scale performance up to a theoretical 1800 MHz. By doing so, we assume that memory bandwidth is basically unlimited, which for gaming anyways is pretty much the same thing as the 1TB per second throughput of the 7's VRAM. After inserting the clock speeds into our formula, we get a score of roughly 8,500 points. Even when giving them the benefit of the doubt and adding another 10% performance gain for the memory on top of that, we get a score of 9,340 points. That at least gets us in the neighborhood of a 1080 Ti, but is a far fetch from the 2080. For that, the card would need over 12% more performance. So here is my problem with the Radeon VII. Clearly they had other improvements to be made in order to get anywhere near the RTX 2080. Even if the rumors of a tweaked architecture on the 7 are true, I think a lot of gains are pure software optimization. Both versions of the Vega architecture do not excel in gaming workloads. They are compute cards that have been made fit to game reasonably well, mind you. Sure, memory bandwidth will most certainly help 7's performance scaling, but there is no way this makes up for this big of a difference. At the end of the day, I think it will come down to software. The question that poses itself here is how much of this performance gain we will see on Vega cards. The architecture overall is pretty much the same capability-wise, so theoretically Vega owners could see quite a performance increase down the road. Now, this is the tinfoil hat, non-scientific part of this video, so let's take the following with a bit of salt, a heavy pinch of salt. In a leak over on AdoredTV, published on the 19th of January, Jim talked about a source inside AMD that told him that they were selling Radeon 7s at a loss of about $50 per card. Considering that AMD already recycled the in-part defective MI60s as Radeon Instinct MI50, honestly there is no need for them to find a way to get rid of the Vega 20 GPUs with only 60 working CUs. In my opinion, which is, mind you, based in part on speculation and in part on well-educated guesses, the only reason that this card exists is for AMD to at least have something for now. It's basically a marketing stunt. They have such momentum in the CPU and data center space that they don't want to lose it under any circumstance. They want to stay in the conversation. They want to stay a relevant name. When Radeon VII's performance turns out what it seems like right now, the card will be obsolete by summer, since that's when Navi is rumored to be launched. And at the rumored performance, Navi will be scratching 7's backside. But this is enough. By then the Radeon VII will have served its purpose. For me, this is kind of disappointing, since competition, especially in the high end, decreases price and drives technological progress. But for now, 7 looks more like a Frontier Edition too, although I would love to be proven wrong.